Start. So welcome to the Philosophy of Psychiatry webinar. We are really happy to welcome Elizabeth Schechter, who's an associate professor of philosophy with a specialization in the philosophy of psychology and cognitive science in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Maryland, College Park. Much of her work centers on questions of psychological unity, which bear on a number of traditional philosophical concerns, including personal identity, self-knowledge, the unity of consciousness, and the nature of belief. She has published many papers and book chapters, including Intentions and Unified Agency in Mind and Language, and Unity of Consciousness in the Routledge Handbook of Consciousness. She has also published with Oxford University Press the book Self-Consciousness and Split Brains in 2018. And so today her talk is entitled Introducing Plurals. So Dr. Schechter, the floor is yours.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to share my screen. Thanks very much for inviting me here. This seems like a very cool seminar I was able to attend. I mean, I only learned about it when I was invited to it, but I attended one recently and it was really great. Anyway, it's great to have the opportunity to speak to you all. So yes, the title of today's talk will be Introducing Plurals. Okay, so the background for this talk, let me minimize this. The philosophical literature on candidate cases of plural persons, on candidate cases of multiple persons in one body, has thus far focused on two particular kinds of case, the split brain phenomenon on the one hand, and dissociative identity disorder on the other hand. And these conditions are very different from each other, but both have been viewed as characterized by a systematic lack of integration between personal level psychological states and processing. And it's for this reason, this putative commonality, that both have been seen as candidate cases of multiple personhood. What I'm going to do in today's talk is propose a new candidate case of multiple personhood. I've been having some trouble with PowerPoint today, and it's like, I don't know if you can see, but there's like a delay between when I press advance and when things pop up, but hopefully
there is a little delay, but we can see pretty well. Yeah, we can follow it.
Annoying though. I hope it doesn't crash. Anyway, so I'm going to propose today a new candidate case of multiple personhood. This population overlaps with, but is distinct from the population of human beings with dissociative identity disorder. But the population I'm going to introduce today, their claim to being multiple persons, rather than resting on third personal grounds, again, this lack of integration between personal level psychological states, their claim to being multiple persons rests in part upon their own self-conceptions, their own endorsed self-identities. A plural is the human being who claims, I am one of multiple people in this brain. I have an asterisk by claims because if the plural identity claim is true, and a plural, right, one of these human beings does in fact have multiple persons in their brain, then strictly speaking, it's not the human being as a whole who claims anything. It would be one or more persons within this human being that makes this claim. So if we wanted, we could just say that a plural is a human being out of whose mouth issues a sentence like, I am one of multiple people in this brain. So plurals believe that there are multiple persons standing in the same essential relation to their brain that I believe I, and I alone, stand into my brain. The multiple persons posited to share a brain are called headmates or system mates in the community. And the collection of headmates associated with the brain is called a system. So whereas I'm using the term plural to refer to the human being, the term system is slightly different. The term system is referring to a collection of persons, right, that are believed to postulate to share a brain. So the questions I'm going to consider here are, first, what is plural identity? Second, who has a plural identity, right? Who are the members of this population? Third, is the plural identity claim metaphorical on the one hand or delusional on the other hand? And fourth, what is the basis of the plural identity claim? That will also be the outline of the talk. I think realistically, I probably won't have time to talk about everything I could talk about under section 4. In addition, there was an initial draft of the talk in which, in addition to discussing these topics here, I had a section in which I commented on the significant overlap there appears to be between the population of plurals on the one hand and the population of transgender individuals and autistic people on the other hand. And I offered some possible explanations for the overlap between these populations. I had to cut that for reasons of time, but it's something I could, but it's something I could address in Q&A. A limitation of the work is that there's very little academic literature on this population, as I define them. There's like 2 or 3 articles on them, and none of them are by philosophers. So this means that I'm going to be drawing in part on non-academic sources. A nice thing is that most of the relevant philosophical literature is on dissociative identity disorder specifically, and is 20 or 30 years old, because that was the heyday of that literature. And so that literature predates the creation and proliferation of online communities for and by plurals. And these online communities offer vital anthropological evidence relevant to the investigation. In addition, I've been fortunate enough to hugely benefit from personal conversation with a number of plurals. The paper I'm presenting is exploratory and introductory. It doesn't defend an overarching thesis, though I do hope to at least convince you that there is a sufficiently cohesive population of interest here that deserves careful study. First, what is plural identity? I am going to use a simple doxastic criterion for being plural. A plural is a human being who believes. The asterisk is again indicating that if the plural identity claim is true, it's not the human being as a whole that believes this, but one or more headmates within them. But a plural is a human being who believes that multiple people are sharing their brain. As we shall see, a plural does not believe I am multiple people in one brain, right? First personal identity statements from a plural are instead going to look more like I am one of multiple people in this brain, right? This seemingly unitary doxastic criterion, maybe unsurprisingly, it concerns actually a belief or a network of beliefs that is complex and that can be articulated in terms of 5 features. So first, it is phenomenologically grounded. If I'm reading some like personal identity literature, some teletransportation stuff, some David Lewis, and I end up, concluding that actually there must be multiple persons, right, associated with my body right now, and that I am just one of these persons. This is not enough to make me a member of the population of interest. This would be a purely theoretical belief that is not derived from experience or grounded in experience in any way. Rather, plurals have routine, right, systematic experiences as of there being multiple psychological beings inside them. So here we have a quote from one headmate who says, I don't bother engaging with skeptics because the experience is subjective and cannot be tested. All I could say would be that I have experienced something that was real to me. I could do nothing tangible to convince anyone that I'm not alone in here, right? And that experience is the ultimate basis, right, of their plural identity. Second of all, a plural doesn't just have experiences as of there being multiple psychological beings inside their brain, but they actually believe that there are truly multiple psychological beings sharing their brain. This is not true of many people with dissociative identity disorder, for instance, since people with dissociative identity disorder also have, routinely experience, have experiences as of there being other psychological beings inside their head, but, those experiences lend themselves to a number of interpretations. Again, what's interesting about a plural is that a plural actually truly believes that these multiple psychological beings are real. Third, a plural believes that these multiple psychological beings are genuine persons. Again, there are people with DID who think that, yes, there may be, even that their experiences may suggest the existence of some sort of entity, person-like entity within themselves, but they don't believe they rise to the level of being actual persons. A plural does, including they think that these persons have rights, right? They are all ethically on par with each other. So here, one headmate says, we have a very strong commitment to operating collectively and viewing at each other as persons with equal dignity and deserving of our existence. We make decisions by a process of consensus, which is not unanimity. Again, at least in the population, right, I'm focusing on here, there's a lot of discussion about, the rights to respect and autonomy that each headmate should enjoy. Fourth, and this feature follows from the previous one, against the background of, I think, the kind of widely shared belief that true persons don't contain persons as parts, a plural believes that the human being as a whole is not a person, right, but a group of people. And so, again, a plural is not going to say, I am many people, or I contain many people, right? Each I is supposed to refer to only one person within the human being. So for instance, this headmate says, I call myself one, I am writing this letter, I am only myself, I have one identity, one sense of self, one personality. Although I'm conjoined inseparably from the other members of my group, when I'm not on front, not controlling behavior, not at the forefront of consciousness. My own I is no longer there. I am in a state like sleep. Some other person now walks around in our body. Someone who is their own I, their own internal narrative, their own wants and desires. When they step away from the front, yet another I will take their place. And they continue, if someone can understand that essential fact at the heart of what multiplicity is, then phrases like your other selves, or when you were that other person, or the other you become obvious non sequiturs. I don't have other selves. I am never anyone but myself, right? So expressing actually something, actually expressing the kind of identity I would express, except that the plural believes that rather than the human being as a whole expressing this, right, again, it's a headmate within the human being that's expressing this. And then finally, and this feature I think follows from the previous two, a plural believes that system mates, right, headmates within a system, properly relate to each other in fundamentally interpersonal ways rather than intrapersonal ways. We already had this quote about trying to make decisions, right, by consensus. That's not the way I would speak about my trying to make decisions under conditions in which I'm ambivalent about something. Headmates like and dislike each other. They can be friends, enemies, frenemies. They can cease to be on speaking terms. Headmates within a system can be romantically attracted to each other. They can be sexually involved. I know of at least one case in which there were two same gender identified headmates within one system, and they were attracted to each other, but for a long time did not pursue a relationship due to their own internalized homophobia, right? They thought that this would be a queer relationship, and they were, again, they had this internalized homophobia, and that held them back. There are analogs for, we have these ways of talking sometimes, like I can speak of being of two minds, right, when I'm ambivalent about something. But, when you ask headmates, it's quite interesting. I mean, the ones I've asked have reported at least that, yes, there's such a thing as conflict between headmates in my system, and there's such a thing as ambivalence or being torn or uncertain. I have experienced both of those things, and they are different, right? It is one thing for me to feel torn between two options, and another thing for me to confidently want one thing, and for my headmate to confidently say, no, I want something else. Okay, who has a plural identity? The population does overlap substantially with one that you probably have heard of, human beings with dissociative identity disorder, which was once in the US called multiple personality disorder, and I believe is still called that in Europe. Here are the first two diagnostic criteria for dissociative identity disorder in the DSM. These are the criteria that are really distinctive of dissociative identity disorder. So first criterion A, disruption of identity characterized by two or more distinct personality states. This involves marked discontinuity in the sense of self and sense of agency, accompanied by related alterations in affect, behavior, consciousness, memory, perception, cognition, and/or sensory motor functioning. These signs and symptoms may be observed by others or reported by the individual, right? So this is the multiple identities criterion. Criterion B is the amnesia criterion, recurrent gaps in the recall of everyday events, important personal information, and/or traumatic events that are inconsistent with ordinary forgetting. Again, these are the criteria that are distinctive of DID. In addition, like many other mental disorders, the diagnostic criteria for DID come with a criterion C, a distress criterion, right, where these symptoms need to be causing significant distress or impairment in, social or occupational or educational or other realms of functioning. And then there's an exclusion criterion D, which says, that the symptoms can't be better explained by drug use or pretend play in children or widely accepted cultural practices. Okay, so I'm going to take it that all human beings with DID are multiples. That is, that they have experiences as of there being other psychological beings inside their brain somehow. Again, I'm just going to assume that all people with DID are multiples. Nothing hinges on this, but for simplicity, I'll assume that. Since I have specified that the doxastic criterion for being plural involves this sort of phenomenological aspect, I will take it that all plurals are multiples as well. But the population of plurals and the population of DID multiples are not coextensive for two reasons. First of all, many multiples with DID do not meet the doxastic criterion for being plural. Even if I'm right in my assumption that all people with DID do, frequently have these experiences as of there being multiple psychological beings inside oneself, you could draw different beliefs from those experiences, right? There are people with DID who think that those experiences are just illusory somehow. Again, there are also people who think that there are these other multiple psychological entities within them, but they deny that they rise to the level of being persons. There are even some who claim that this is hard to make sense of, that they are all persons, but that they themselves are somehow the collection of these persons. None of these beliefs would allow a multiple to meet the doxastic criterion that I've offered. Okay, so that's one reason why the populations are not coextensive. Also, many plurals do not meet DSM criteria for DID. So just as there are people with DID who aren't plurals, there are plurals who don't have DID. Of the plurals who don't have DID, some of them are traumagenic multiples. Oh, I should note, I will also assume that DID is traumagenic. That is that trauma is one necessary factor, right, in the development of DID. Again, nothing really hinges on that here, but that is the way I will talk in this talk, as though traumagenesis, traumagenic systems, and DID, right, go together. So some plurals are traumagenic multiples. Their systems are the product of trauma, but they no longer meet, or perhaps never met, the full diagnostic criteria for DID. For instance, they might no longer meet the distress criterion, right? Or perhaps they never met the distress criterion. But also, in addition, some plurals are not traumagenic and are very far from meeting the DID criterion. There are two main etiologies of systems. So first, there are traumagenic systems. Again, I'm going to assume that this includes all plurals with DID, right? Where trauma is a necessary factor, perhaps the primary factor, right, in the development of these multiple psychological entities, right? And yeah. And then the second main system etiology, I will speak of topogenic systems. Topogenic systems are systems that were formed on the basis of the practice of tulpomancy. So tulpomancy is a practice or a set of practices that have the aim of creating a separate sentient being inside one's brain. In these communities, tulpomancer is the term that is used to refer to the initially like the singlet. Singlet is someone who's not a multiple, not a plural, like I'm a singlet. Initially the singlet who creates this separate sentient being, and then tulpo would be the term used to refer to, any sentient being that is thereby created by these practices. There may also be systems with other etiologies, so there's a lot of debate in these communities about the existence of natural/endogenic systems. These are supposed to be systems that are the product neither of trauma nor of intentionally undertaking the creation of headmates. These could exist, right? Maybe, some people claim that was just always the way they were. Endogenic systems get more complicated. First of all, it becomes difficult to classify systems. So for instance, I spoke to several plurals who, kind of casually mentioned that writers of fiction often inadvertently create headmates. If you, and unwittingly, right, not knowing that that's what they've created. If you thought that were true, how would you classify such a writer of fiction? On the one hand, they did intentionally engage in practices that created, right, a new sentient being, right? They thought very carefully, they vividly imagined this character and they pictured what this character would do in different types of circumstances, right? And may have queried them in various ways. So it looks like intentional creation of a headmate in that sense, but of course they weren't trying to create an actual sentient being. From their perspective, they were just trying to imagine a character. It's also a diagnosis of exclusion. It's hard, someone might claim to be in an endogenic system, but it's hard to rule out the possibility that in fact trauma played a precipitating role. So I'm going to ignore endogenic systems and what follows and only speak of traumagenic and tulpogenic systems. This is not drawn to scale. I have no idea of the actual, I don't know the actual numbers, but, it gives a sense of, I don't know, this could be roughly correct. So we have here the largest figure. This represents the multiples that there are in the world. The majority of these, I assume, are going to be traumagenic multiples or multiples with DID. And then we have plurals, again, the majority of whom, presumably, are traumagenic or have DID, but then there's some percentage of plurals who actually are multiples but are not traumagenic. So this is how I'm understanding the relationship between these different populations and subpopulations. There are interesting commonalities and differences between these types of systems. Traumagenic systems tend to be larger. I met a couple of topogenic systems that are just parties of two, right? There's the topomancer and they're one tulpa. And in both cases, the topomancer told me, really, you wouldn't want more than one tulpa. You have to give up 50% of your, decision-making power. You wouldn't want to suddenly be outnumbered. I didn't meet a traumagenic system that was smaller than like 12, and they can be quite large, 60, 80, 100. Obviously, if you have intentional control over how many headmates you produce, you can keep the number small if you wish. Traumagenic systems form earlier. I mean, at a minimum, not only is DID believed to, have to kind of onset around the time that like personality is typically forming and stabilizing, but also obviously if you're a topogenic system, you're not going to become one until at least you encounter topo communities online, right? Headmates in traumagenic systems have a greater tendency to form via splitting off. This is not the only way that traumagenic systems, that headmates form, and I don't want to overstate the point, but splitting off is a means of headmate creation whereby you have one person, headmate, singlet, whatever, that has like a complex of characteristics, like say has characteristic A and characteristic B. And that person perhaps ceases to exist. Two new headmates are formed, one of which has characteristic A, but not characteristic B, one of which has characteristic B, but not characteristic A. So it's this kind of, it is a dichotomizing, it's dividing up, right, a complex of features and assigning some subset of them to each of two headmates, right? So you can end up then with headmates in traumagenic systems that are very different from each other, right? And that's kind of by design. In tulpamancy communities, it's widely believed that, it's very advantageous to create a tulpa who has quite a bit in common with you. Complementarity can be valuable too. And certainly sometimes a tulpamancer will try to imagine, if a tulpamancer knows that, he has problems with some particular thing, he might try to create a tulpa who's better at that thing, right? Or who enjoys doing that thing more or something. But that said, if you have intentional control of the process, and you're going to be sharing, in a sense, your mental life and certainly your body, right, with this other sentient being, you can see why it would be really useful if you had a lot of shared interests, shared values, and so on. And so headmates tend to have a lot more in common. And then finally, and most significantly, topogenic systems are unlikely to meet DID criteria. So recall again, criterion A has to do with this disruption of identity. Criterion B is the amnesia criterion. And then the distress criterion would be criterion C. So first of all, tulpas are sometimes created precisely to help with psychological distress of some kind. And from what I've observed and what's reported in some other work, they do in fact seem to help. Tulpamancers, it doesn't always work like this, right? But usually they are reporting that their tulpa has been extremely helpful. And so they're unlikely to meet criterion C, to be distressed by, right, or impaired by their multiplicity per se, right? And one of the reasons they're unlikely to be not impaired by it also is that topogenic systems do not meet the amnesia criterion. Headmates in topogenic systems tend to be perfectly aware of each other's thoughts, experiences, and actions. And so there's not really a scope for one of them to, there can be slight things, but for the most part, one of them is going to, they're going to all remember the same things. Why this difference? Why don't topogenic systems meet the distress criterion or the amnesia criterion? Trauma causes dissociation, right? Especially dissociation is sometimes used to include things like, zoning out during a workout, right? Or daydreaming or something. And those things aren't dysfunctional or impairing, but trauma causes not just dissociation, but it can cause really impairing dissociation. And both trauma and amnesia cause distress, right? So this was something that was, not saying this is totally uncontroversial, but what was emphasized to me by systems both traumagenic and topogenic is that the disruption of identity, which looks, on the classical understanding, is part of the impairment of DID, right? The classical view is that, yes, the amnesia is bad, the distress and impairment are bad. We work on those things for, the first thing we try to do is reduce distress. And, one of the ways we can do that is by working on, memory and communication and so on. But ultimately, the classical view is that like full recovery requires that criterion A no longer be met either, right? That all these identity states are kind of integrated, right, into one, right, and into a single person. Topomancy, you might think, challenges this, right? If you can be a multiple, right, if you can identify as a system with all these headmates and yet not meet the amnesia criterion, not feel distressed or impaired by your multiplicity at all, then that raises the question of whether multiplicity per se is impairing in DID and is an appropriate target of intervention. As for criterion A, as I mentioned before, topogenic systemates often have a lot in common, and thus they are not starkly different from each other with respect to affect, behavior, consciousness, memory, perception, cognition, and or sensory motor function of the sort that criterion A mentions. That said, this is an important commonality between the two kinds of systems. Plural identity is phenomenologically grounded for both groups. That is, both traumagenic and topogenic systems are multiples. They have frequent experiences as of having more than one psychological being in one's body or brain. So you might think, okay, so we could then say that all plurals, including topogenic plurals, meet criterion A, or at least are on the road to meeting criterion A, because criterion A refers to marked discontinuity in sense of self and sense of agency. And these discontinuities are still there in a topogenic system, right? When headmate A is doing something, headmate B will have the powerful phenomenological sense that it is not headmate B doing it. Headmate B will not feel like the self or the agent, right, who is thinking that thought or performing that action. So perhaps you can see why someone might be tempted to say, okay, fine, maybe they don't meet full, I've met some people who I think have this temptation. Maybe they don't meet full diagnostic criteria for having this serious mental disorder, but they are on the road towards meeting criteria, right? And that's a bad thing. But the issue is that if we're taking meeting criterion A to be a bad thing, arguably, to say that topogenic plurals meet criterion A, to say that all plurals meet criterion A, kind of just begs the question against the plural identity claim. So if I'm, spending a lot of time with my sister, every time she says something, I will have the sense that that wasn't me that said it. Every time she does something, I will have the sense that that wasn't me that did that. Does that mean that, I'm on the road to meeting criterion A because of these discontinuities and sense of self and sense of agency? Well, no, of course not, because we assume, yeah, but your sister is a different self. She is a different agent. So of course, I don't have the sense of self or the sense of agency for her actions. But that's what plurals claim is true within their systems too. Why would headmate A have a sense of self or a sense of agency for, actions that are the actions of a distinct person? Okay, is the plural identity claim metaphorical or delusional? I don't hear, or in the paper this talk is drawn from, defend or reject the plural identity claim. Here, I just want to respond to two arguments to the effect that the claim requires no serious or careful investigation or evaluation, that it can simply be dismissed out of hand, right? So these are both just kind of, there are a number of very good objections to the plural identity claim, right? I have some objections myself, but these are dismissive objections, right? Again, that like, it's not even worth sort of like getting into it or carefully considering it. So the first objection I call the metaphor objection. One might think that the plural identity claim can't be meant literally, that it's just a metaphor. And for this to work as a dismissive objection, again, to the effect that we don't need to carefully engage with the claim or consider it, The objection must be not just that it's metaphorical, but that, you know, if we understood the metaphorical meaning of the claim, we could just all say, oh, sure, yeah, right, obviously, that's true. That the metaphorical reading is one that's, you know, kind of banal, right, if we only knew what it was. So is the plural identity claim meant metaphorically? In one sense, yeah, obviously, plurals will concede this. As one headmate put it to me, the most literal meaning of two different people would be two completely separate people who are housed separately, basically, housed in different bodies, that is, people who are not co-embodied. You know, granting that, however, they said that their own plural identity claim was about as literal as it can be with us still being in the same body. So this is a reason, you know, it does seem to me that you can distinguish between degrees of metaphor, right? And again, it seems reasonable to say that like the most metaphorical meaning of the claim that there are, you know, two people present in this room is that there are two human beings, right, with, you know, certain properties, right, who are in this room. But the metaphorical meaning of the claim could still be controversial, right? To say that it's a metaphor in that obvious sense doesn't yet say what the metaphorical meaning is, right? And once the claim is given that proper interpretation, whatever it is, it could still mean something very bold and striking and something requiring careful investigation. Certainly, what plurals deny is that the claim is equivalent in meaning to familiar metaphors used to talk about ordinary ambivalence, complexity, interpersonal influence, change. So it's not just saying that, you know, it's not equivalent in meaning to metaphors like, I'm of two minds about this. I'm a completely different person when I'm at work. What I said before, that was my father speaking. I don't identify with who I was then. So consider this system who writes, the popular and mistaken reasoning goes that we all have different sides to ourselves, and some people build a delusion around this natural state and come to believe that the different sides in themselves are different identities, including assigning names to these states. It's completely true that people express different sides of themselves according to different contexts, but this is different from multiplicity. Members of a multiple group will individually experience themselves as having these different sides, just like everyone else. One way to think about this is topogenic systems were once singlets, right? They haven't just learned, at least what they report, it's not just that they've learned a new set of terms in which to talk about what they were always experiencing and what their minds were always like. What they claim is that their mental lives are now very different, right? And that's why their use of this language of multiple persons, right, is justified. So what a couple of plurals expressed to me is that, like, at a minimum, the plural identity claim, like, you could call it a metaphor, but it's a metaphor for something that singlets do not experience. It's not just a metaphorical way of talking about, you know, messy human psychology, you know, that everyone is familiar with, right? It's again talking about something that is different, right, about a plural's mind. And the question then becomes what exactly the claim means, right? And whether that meaning is true, right? Once, you know, if we work out what it's a metaphor for. It can't just be that, well, if it's not literally true, don't worry about it. It must be something banal and we don't need to carefully consider it. So for instance, it could turn out that ethical questions about how to relate to systems turn more on the metaphorical truths than on the literal ones. In addition, I will note, and I don't know whether any of you agree, to me, there's also something, maybe it would depend on like whether you're an animalist. To me, there's also something puzzling about reference to the literal meaning of talk about persons. So we can compare this to the otherkin identity claim. I don't know if you've heard of otherkin, but these are people, whether headmates or singlets, who claim that they are animals of some kind, non-human animals or fantastical creatures like dragons, right? So, you know, I spoke to one headmate who said she is a fox, right? And she was very adamant about this. You know, clearly foxes don't say I am a fox, right? And foxes don't identify as foxes. So, and that's obvious. Everyone knows that. So even in making the claim I am a fox, the claim seems to undermine itself, which does suggest that like it must have a meaning that is different from the literal meaning. But, you know, I think it's clear what would be needed to make it true of a speaker or a thinker that they were a fox. Like it would have to be an actual fox, right? And, you know, I don't know the Latin name for the species, but, you know, an actual member of that species would have to be making that claim in order for the claim to be like literally true. But when it comes to persons, it's controversial amongst philosophers. What, if anything, would be needed to make it true of a human being that they were associated with multiple persons? Like, I just think the literal meaning of any claims about persons, and certainly any claim about, you know, multiple personhood, is just not obvious, right? In the way that, you know, claims about foxes are. Okay, and second, the delusion objection. This second objection is just that the plural identity claim is nuts. This is not, you know, this is not a delicate way of putting it, but it's, I believe, like what some people are thinking. So here the idea is it's not just that it's false, which it could well be, but that it's delusional. Again, not worthy of any kind of serious investigation. And, you know, one way you might motivate this objection is you might say, look, it's, you know, as I said, it's phenomenologically grounded. For instance, it's motivated in significant part by experiences of thought insertion, right? Where people have the sense that a thought is just in their mind, but is not their actual thought. And these experiences of thought insertion, which figure prominently in the literature on schizophrenia, are commonly taken to be a species of hallucination. Beliefs formed on the basis of hallucination are unjustified, right? So here's how you could make that argument. But while experiences of thought insertion, or if, you know, thoughts that again just seem to be coming from outside oneself, right? Thoughts that do not appear to be one's own, and, you know, for which one does not appear to be the agent of them. Experiences of thought insertion could be, that should say, the same in both groups, but judgments of thought insertion differ between them. So consider some examples from the schizophrenia literature. I look out the window and I think that the garden looks nice and the grass looks cool, but the thoughts of Eamon Andrews come into my mind. There are no other thoughts there, only his. He treats my mind like a screen and flashes his thoughts into it like you flash a picture. Thoughts are put into my mind like kill God. It is just like my mind working, but it isn't. They come from this chap, Chris. They are his thoughts. I don't know how many of you have heard these examples before. I chose these specific examples because they're commonly cited in the philosophical literature on the sense of ownership and the sense of agency and the lack thereof, and the literature on selfhood and schizophrenia. Okay, so in schizophrenia, these inserted thoughts that feel alien, are judged to be the thoughts of another human being or another external entity, right? An alien, an angel, and so on, is judged to have like had some sort of direct influence on one's brain, right? Placing thoughts in one's brain. In plurals, inserted thoughts are judged to be the thoughts of another person sharing one's brain, rather than the thoughts of an entity external to one's brain and body. And therefore, the comparison between these two cases is inexact for two reasons. First of all, it's empirically implausible that one human being should be able to directly place thoughts in another human being's brain. It might not always be empirically plausible. People are working on these technologies right now that would enable, right, this to happen. But at present, the technologies arguably, well, first of all, they're not quite able to do that yet. Second of all, when they approach something like that, you have to actually like go to a lab and sign consent forms, right? And it's in a controlled, right, environment, right, where, you know, you're hooked up to this machinery. You're not just like walking around your kitchen and someone is able to like place thoughts in your brain. So there's just like an empirical implausibility to the judgment here. How empirically implausible is it that you would be aware of the thoughts of another person whose brain was just yours? If it were possible for there to be another person in your brain, it seems like totally plausible, right? That you would be aware of some of their thoughts. I mean, not necessarily, who knows how that would work on a neural level, but it's not empirically implausible. Of course, the plural identity claim, you know, to many singlets at least, is going to look wild in some way, but not empirically wild, right? It looks metaphysically wrong, right, to a lot of singlets. But, you know, and this is going to be my next point, believing a false metaphysics typically isn't sufficient to be delusional. Right? Delusion has to do with sort of like evidence, right, and empirical beliefs. A second difference is that thoughts and other mental events in one brain can't make it true that some being external to that brain exists. but it certainly seems plausible that thoughts and other mental events in one brain make it possible that a person associated with that brain exists. For instance, if my brain didn't have any thoughts or mental events, it seems plausible that I would not exist. So perhaps thoughts and other mental events in one brain can make it possible that multiple persons associated with that brain exist. I mean, again, perhaps not, but that can't be, again, now we're getting into like hard, metaphysical questions here. Now, obviously, it might be questioned whether hearing a voice in inner speech justifies believing that I exist, or whether my having inner speech at all is in any way essential to my existence. Of course, it might be questioned whether thoughts or mental events in one brain can make it possible that more than one person associated with that brain exists. But now we're getting into familiar territory about the nature of the self and its relationship to first-person narration. And to the extent that the truth of the plural identity claim hinges on controversies in this familiar territory, the claim can hardly be dismissed as delusional. So Dennett once wrote that the idea of multiple selves in one body strikes many people as too outlandish and metaphysically bizarre to believe, a paranormal phenomenon to discard along with ESP, close encounters of the third kind, and witches on broomsticks. I suspect that some of these people have made a simple arithmetical mistake. They failed to notice that 2 or 3 or 17 selves per body is really no more metaphysically extravagant than 1 self per body. 1 is bad enough. Now, again, accounts of personal identity that make the plural identity claim even possibly true may, of course, be wrong, right? Maybe animalists are correct. But it doesn't seem fair to dismiss the claim as delusionable simply because it assumes a controversial metaphysics, which some prominent philosophers have endorsed. Okay, next, the meaning and basis of the plural identity claim. Looking at the time, I'm only going to have time to do the first part of this, but it is, I think, the more important part anyway. Okay, here is a problem, I think, for the plural identity claim. What individuation criteria are plurals themselves using to individuate these headmates? There's a kind of problem in trying to understand the claim. Let me back up and talk about the philosophical literature on DID multiples. So this is personal identity literature, and it's assuming these would be the individuating criteria for the candidate persons within one DID human being. Differences in affect, behavior, personality, and so on might mark the boundaries of persons, or discontinuities in episodic memory and self-knowledge might mark the boundaries between persons. Note that these criteria bear some resemblance to DSM criteria A and B, respectively, and are motivated by what I call the stereotypic picture of multiplicity. This is how DID is presented in a number of philosophical works on the condition. So the stereotypic picture says different alters or headmates have starkly different personality, values, other highly identity-relevant characteristics, and different alters have completely separate streams of conscious experience, as a consequence of which they are unaware of each other's existence, except perhaps very directly. One alter, to use the clinical term, finds a receipt from a shopping spree that they have no memory of having gone on. Okay, so note that these criteria are third personal. Psychological testing could reveal whether a particular human being does or does not meet these criteria. And the philosophical, debate on personal identity and D, it mostly consists of people debating whether or not these are good criteria. They assume that people with DID meet the criteria, and then they're debating whether these are, valid criteria for individuating persons. So, skeptics complain that, alters, according to the stereotypic picture, are two-dimensional to be persons, right? Like there's the passive one and the angry one, and then they'll say, but real people are passive in some contexts and angry in other contexts, right? Therefore, it's really the human being as a whole, right, that, is the most richly textured, psychological being of the sort persons are. The problem is that plurals deny that the stereotypic picture of multiplicity is accurate. They deny that it offers a correct characterization of systems in general, or even the majority of systems. So for instance, one DID multiple writes, one of the beliefs perpetuated by early therapists was that since all selves were assumed to be a part of an original person, each of them was only capable of a single function or emotion, the angry one, the scared one, the seductive one, and so on. And then they say, there are people who do mistake having different aspects of their self for having separate selves, or name their moods and decide them to be different personalities. But we're certain we're not doing anything like that. Why? Well, all of us have full ranges of emotion and don't identify in particular with one emotion. We're all capable of being happy, upset, scared, angry, etc. We don't switch every time we start feeling a particular emotion. Or here, another traumagenic system on the amnesia criterion says it's possible for multiple groups to have continuity of consciousness between persons. A memory as good as anyone else's. In a responsible, healthy system, if something important happens, people, i.e. headmates, will be told one way or the other, even in systems with little or no co-consciousness. If we need to remember something, we will ask our other headmates about it and obtain that information, right? Suggesting again that the stereotypic picture of multiplicity is false. Okay, but this is a problem because again, the stereotypic picture of multiplicity, you know, you can derive individuating criteria from it that, again, you can argue about whether or not those are philosophically good criteria for individuating persons. But at least it's clear what the criteria are, right? And they can be, they're third personal criteria again. You can tell whether a human being meets, you know, at least extensive testing would reveal whether a human being meets or does not meet those criteria. But if those criteria are off the table because that's not what systems are like generally, right? And that's not what headmates are like generally, then what individuating criteria are plurals using? It seems to be first personal, phenomenological first and foremost. I think they are individuating using discontinuities in their experiences of ownership and agency. So, you know, this action or experience feels like mine, whereas that action or experience, you know, that action that I saw my body perform did not feel like mine. Therefore, you know, this experience, which felt like mine, is mine. And that other action, which didn't feel like mine, is theirs, right? Headmate twos. And there's this usual puzzle, you know, how could a person judge of, say, a sentence that she hears in inner speech that it isn't hers? But there's a lot of literature on this. There's competing accounts of how the sense of disownership happens. However it happens, again, it doesn't seem unreasonable for one headmate to think that they were capable of experiencing another headmate's thoughts that wouldn't feel to the first headmates like theirs, if that other headmate exists. But the question is, why think that headmate exists in the first place? So the different puzzle is, it's one thing for headmate one to judge of an action, thought, or experience that it doesn't feel to that headmate like theirs. But on what basis does headmate one judge that that action, thought, or experience did feel to headmate two like theirs? I mean, what headmate one reports is that they lacked the phenomenology of mindness for this action. So how do they know that headmate two had a phenomenology of mindness for this action? Since headmate one lacked that phenomenology, they have no introspective access to it, right? And we don't have introspective access to each other's phenomenologies. So what is the basis for H1's consciousness that there was another headmate who actually did have this phenomenology? Now, obviously, headmate one can hear headmate two saying in inner speech, yes, that was me. That action felt to me like mine. But unless headmate one has independent reason to believe that headmate two exists and is sentient, headmate two's saying this is just more inner speech in H1's mind that doesn't feel to H1 like H1's. Okay, note that this is just the problem of other minds, but now it's a problem inside one's own skull. And maybe plurals could say, well, look, I mean, it's, you know, the problem of other minds. No one really walks around asking, you know, worrying that other human beings aren't really sentient. So why should we worry about it for headmates if you don't worry about it for human beings? But obviously we have independent evidence that other human beings exist, right? And then we say, yeah, so presumably they're conscious, right? They have phenomenologies. In the case of plurals, the evidence that your headmate exists rests upon, this is the way they seem to be thinking about it. The evidence that these headmates exist rests upon the claim that they have phenomenology. But if you don't have any independent reason to believe that they exist, why trust their phenomenological reports? This does seem to require a leap of faith on some level. I mean, I had a couple systems that I posed this question to, and, you know, the headmates basically were employing the golden rule. And they said, well, I know that I wouldn't like it if my headmates doubted that I were conscious, so I'm extending them the same, you know, I'm extending them the same faith, right? I'm you know, going to believe them that they have phenomenology. But again, what are the prior grounds for believing that they exist? Of course, you know, you would trust another person that they have phenomenology, but again, the whole claim that there is another person rests upon the idea that they have this phenomenology. But I think the leap might be immediately justified by the practical benefit it allows. So in the case of DID systems, you know, supposedly, once you recognize your headmates are real, they're real persons, you start communicating with them as persons, you can experience pretty immediate improvements in functionality. As opposed, I will note, to undergoing therapy for DID, right, which can take 10 or 20 years, right, to be highly effective. And also maybe on some level, it makes a headmate feel psychologically more like a singlet. Instead of believing that like, oh, you know, I'm psychologically fractured somehow, and my experiences are really abnormal because I should be feeling that all these things are mine. No, they don't feel like yours because they aren't yours. Again, just the way singlet doesn't feel that another singlet's experiences are theirs. So it makes a headmate, again, psychologically like a singlet, and just happens to be differently embodied, right? And sometimes we're less attached to our embodiment. As for the case of a tulpa system, the psychological benefit, you know, at a minimum, the same psychic benefits that it no doubt has when one believes that one is talking to and hearing from a loving God. All right, and for reasons of time, I will skip this next part, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. So now we have time for questions. So if you could maybe unshare your screen for now,